First basemen are usually known for having absurd amounts of power. There's a typical makeup and stereotype for how a first baseman should look and perform. If you want to be more specific, there was most definitely a stereotype for first basemen in the quote-unquote steroid era. Like, look at what first basemen typically did to the ball around this time.
There it goes! See you later!
Well, good players come in all shapes and sizes. Breaking the mold of a typical position is fine as long as the player still pulls their weight. Meet John Olerud. He was a first baseman with over 15 years of big league experience to his name. He also played very differently from his peers, and that caused him to become kind of forgotten. And that was unfair, because John Olerud was really good at baseball. The best place to start the story of how John Olerud was really good at baseball is his legendary college career. John Olerud was one of the best players college baseball has ever seen. The award for the best two-way player in college baseball is actually named after John Olerud. Just look at his sophomore season at Washington State. These hitting numbers are insane. He also pitched a little bit too. Now, just because you're a two-way player doesn't necessarily mean, okay, his pitching numbers were also insane. And then something bad happened. He had a brain aneurysm in January of his junior year. Unbelievably, he returned to action that season, and only hit .359 that season in 1989. As a result of the brain aneurysm, John Olerud started wearing a batting helmet in the field. It was for extra protection because you can't be too careful after dealing with something like that. Wearing a helmet in the field is probably what John Olerud is most known for. This, coupled with the fact that he told teams that he would only leave college if given a huge signing bonus, let John Olerud slip to the third round, where the Toronto Blue Jays drafted him. Let's move on to John Olerud's minor league career. That was it. That was the whole thing. John Olerud played 3 minor league games ever. They were in 2005. The Blue Jays promoted him directly to the major leagues in 1989. He was so good that he went from being a college student who suffered a brain aneurysm in January to a Major League Baseball player in September. We're going to skip ahead to 1992, a year where John Olerud was the starting first baseman on the World Series winning Blue Jays. He walked more than he struck out for the first time in a season, and did that every year until 2004, where he did both things the same number of times. In 1992, John rocked a .284 batting average with a .375 OBP and 127 OPS+, and he had 16 home runs with 66 runs batted in. 1993 though, 1993 was not ready for John Olerud. In 1993, John Olerud hit 24 home runs and drove in 107 runs. Those were some of his weaker stats. He hit 54 doubles, was hitting 400 into August, but quote, only hit .363, and had an OBP of .473. His OPS plus was also .186. We mentioned the stat OPS plus earlier, but we should probably explain it here to tell you just how good John Olerud was in 1993. OPS plus is a stat that normalizes a person's on-base percentage plus their slugging percentage to see how they did relative to their competition in a particular year. It takes the league average of OPS and stadium variables into account to put everyone on the same playing field. The average for OPS Plus is always 100, so you can compare players easier. John Olerud's was 186 that year. That means he was 86% better than an average hitter that year. That's a lot better. The Blue Jays also won the World Series again. Something that's worth noting before we stop talking about 1993, Olerud was only 6th in baseball in walks with 114 that year. These are the 5 people with more. Tony Phillips, whose walk-to-strikeout ratio was way different than Olerud's, even though it's still really impressive. Lenny Dykstra and Darren Daulton were both on the Phillies. Lenny Dykstra claimed that before that season, he paid private investigators $500,000 to dig up dirt on as many umpires as possible, and he would use that information to get a smaller strike zone. There's no telling if he gave that information to his teammates too, but that's good to know here. The other 2 were Ricky Henderson and Barry Bonds. Pretty good players, and a guy who blackmailed the umpires. From 1994 to 1996, his lowest OBP was .382. He was still consistently doing his thing as a strong contact hitter, but was never as good as he was in 1993. Which, can you really blame him, since not many players have had seasons that good in the first place? This leads us into the first example of why John Olerud was misunderstood. Towards the end of his time with the Blue Jays, he faced competition from a younger first baseman the team had. You may have heard of him, his name's Carlos Delgado.
Hit hard. No way! 4 home runs for Delgado.
Delgado and Blue Jays legend Joe Carter were in direct competition with John Olerud for playing time. The Blue Jays and manager Cito Gaston made their decision. Any one of those guys not named John Olerud. Cito Gaston apparently didn't like that John Olerud wasn't aggressive enough. That was kind of the whole point of what made John Olerud good.
Oh my God, can you let me do what I need to do?
That's like being upset that Ichiro didn't hit home runs, or being upset that Steph Curry doesn't dunk all the time. His incredible patience as a hitter and his ability to draw a ton of walks was part of what made him a special hitter. The Blue Jays didn't appreciate that at the time though, and traded him to the Mets. In his 3 years with the Mets, Olerud never had an OBP under 400 and averaged an OPS plus of about 142. In 1998, he hit .354 with an OBP of almost 450. The Mets of the late 90s and 2000 were an exciting bunch that, if not for the Braves, would have went to back-to-back World Series. So it's not like John Olerud was playing well for a bad team. He was part of a group that Sports Illustrated called the best infield ever with those Mets. And that's a perfect segue into another one of John Olerud's talents. John Olerud was a really good defender. He wouldn't be recognized for that though until he joined the Mariners in 2000, when he finally got some credit for how good he was and won 3 Gold Gloves in his 4 full seasons with Seattle. The end of his prime was as a Mariner, but he didn't go quietly. He still hit over 300 with an OBP of 400 and OPS plus of 130 or 140 into his 30s. His career would end after the 2005 season, where he'd still hit 289 with a 344 OBP in his very last season. I can confidently say that John Olerud had a pretty solid career. So why might most baseball fans not know about him? John Olerud was very quiet, humble, and down-to-earth. He would take the subway to Shea Stadium while being the starting first baseman of the Mets.
You know, getting noticed is nice and that sort of thing, but there are times where it's just nice to be a normal person, just be able to blend into the crowd and, you know, walk around and do some things that you want to do. So I like being anonymous.
Imagine just being on the subway in New York City one time and just seeing the first baseman for the Mets on the train with you, going to the game. He didn't have a big personality, and he didn't need to. He didn't seem to let it get into his head that the most popular first basemen of his era were giant dudes with monstrous power. He only made 2 All-Star teams in his career, largely in part because of how his peers played. As we established earlier, John Olerud was not a home run hitter, even though he could still hit some home runs. So it didn't seem like people gave him the credit he deserved. John Olerud broke the mold for his position, and baseball didn't really seem to appreciate it. Imagine if John Olerud played today with that production, with how differently baseball views drawing walks and hitting for average today. Even as home run rates are increasing every year. Cito Gaston once said that John Olerud didn't look like he had fun playing baseball. John Olerud having to tell the media that he liked playing baseball is a really sad thing to me. And it goes to show how his reserved demeanor sort of held him back in a way. And you know what? That's okay. You don't have to have Ken Griffey Jr.'s smile or his commercials to be good at baseball. If I'm putting together a baseball team, I would want a John Olerud on my team. A great player who, despite being overshadowed by his peers, didn't seem to let it bother him as he went out and did his thing each and every day. I admire John Olerud, and it's a shame baseball didn't seem to feel the same way during his career.